Hi, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. Our guest today is Brad Jeavons, as you will unmistakably tell soon enough. He is joining us from Brisbane, Australia. So before I give more of an introduction, Brad, thank you for being here. How's it going?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Really looking forward to the episode. Appreciate being able to come on.
Yeah, sure thing. I could have left that as a big surprise for people who didn't know you. To hear the accent is it's nice to hear. So I'm glad you could join us. That the internet makes it possible for us to connect across all this distance, and we can have a great discussion because I know the work and the things that you're doing there are going to be really applicable. I mean, this really is a global lean movement, and opportunities to learn from each other abound. So I'm glad we can do that today.
Yeah, definitely.
So let me tell you a little bit more about Brad. He's going to tell more about his story, but he is principal consultant with the firm SA Partners. Among other things, he is the author of a book. I think he can hold it up here for those who are watching on YouTube. Agile Sales, Delivering Customer Journeys of Value and Delight. So I think in our podcast today, we're aiming to deliver value and delight. Brad is the host of a podcast called the Enterprise Excellence Podcast, and he was kind enough to have me as a guest on his show. So, and Brad, if you can maybe just first off around the podcast, where people can find it. Do you have a website for the podcast? What episode? I forget what episode number mine was.
Yeah, so to get to the podcast, they can look on any of their podcast apps or go to the enterpriseexcellencepodcast.com. And Mark, your episode was number 20, so very good, mate. Very good feedback and good rating. So I'd recommend anyone go listen to Mark's episode there. And there's also a YouTube channel for it too, which you can get to via the website, the same name, Enterprise Excellence Podcast.
Okay, and I'll link to those in the show notes. So thank you for having me there. But here, so enough about me being on your podcast. So let's learn more about you, Brad, and your background. I always like to ask guests just to help get the ball started. How did you first get introduced to Lean? And then I guess the related question, maybe you can weave it together, is how did you get introduced to Agile? Because I know personally, I know far less about the Agile methodology. Some of the audience here might be in the same boat. So we're going to talk about both of those today. How did you get introduced to these approaches?
Yeah, Mark, I'll go back to a long way, which is I grew up on a farm in Australia, and a lot of you around the world will know the history of Australia with, feast and famine of rain and drought. And it was a small farm, so sometimes when you got a larger farm, the impact's not as hard. But I grew up on a small to medium-sized farm, and you grew up in scarcity. Like it was tough. And so it taught you from an early age to be efficient, do more with less. You've got to bond as a team because you're remote. The people, your family around you is who you're around the whole time. Mm-hmm. And so I think that taught me a lot of the behavioral traits and things that I needed to really go into this career. The only negative of Australian farming is that there's this saying called bind it up with wire to get the show back on the road. So there's a bit of a patch it up type of culture. So the shift into more scientific thinking and root cause is needed. So I'll just say it's not all glorious in that regard.
Sure.
But when I got to university, I focused in on Japan, not because of process or anything like that, just because I love of the culture. Mm-hmm. And that took me down that rabbit warren of really learning about Toyota production systems and total quality management, and also studied McDonalds-ization back then. There is such a thing as McDonalds-ization, and it was really good. And I think it just linked with that passion of growing up, where it was all about having to really be efficient and effective at what you do, and also focus on, the family culture and the bond to really succeed. And I heard this coming out of all this study on Japan, this ultimate focus on teamwork, this ultimate focus on people, this ultimate focus on systems. And I just, bound to it. Mm-hmm. And then early on in my career, I got involved in the software world, and more for a manufacturing point of view. So it was software for automation. But I discovered Agile and learned about the different Scrum techniques coming through and Agile. And really, even Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwab were the founders of Scrum, which really is predominantly what Agile's about, they notify that it comes from Lean. They openly say that Agile's built off of Lean philosophies and Lean practices, and they're passionate about Taichi Ono, and they're passionate about the work of Jeff Leiker and Mike Rothman and so many others. I think again, it's got the same philosophy of how do we form high performance, high cultural focused teams to deliver great outcomes.
Yeah.
So it's very, very similar.
So I want to go back and touch on, or have you elaborate, Brad, on a couple of things that you brought up. You mentioned growing up on a farm. I mean, there are many, I think, associations between Toyota and farming. Toyota, they say, Honda is the big city company, and Toyota is the farmers, because, in the outskirts of Nagoya and Toyota City is surrounded by farmland. And do you think, is there a certain kind of longer term perspective when it comes to growing crops versus growing people, growing an organization, if you will?
Yeah, I think there's high connections. When I was growing up, my father and also neighbours who I'd go over and do work for, they would just say things to me like, "Brad, don't pick something up twice." So there was a saying like that. There was a saying on focus on the right pace. Mm-hmm. You want to be able to run the whole day and get through the day. You don't want to overburden the machine. You don't want to overburden yourself. All these sayings that were just folklore, and it led into my behaviour. The other thing that's interesting too, guys, and I found this out at the end of an episode I recorded with Jeff Sutherland, one of the founders of Scrum and Agile. Jeff grew up on a dairy farm. Mm-hmm. I think there's something innately when you're at the mercy of nature and you're in your family and you've got to survive and succeed, and it's about a dynasty. So there's a bigger purpose to it too. In farming, because most farmers you talk to, it's about what's your purpose. It's never to make money. It's to hand this down to the next generation. And it drives them so emotionally. Like I could go down a rabbit warren on that one, but it's there's some really great elements to what we know is best practice, Lean and Agile nowadays. You can find on most, if not any farm. Yeah.
And I mean, when you talk about handing it down to other generations, I mean, the ability to do so requires making money, but I'm guessing there's a difference between short term and longer term, that you wouldn't want to do something in the short term. I'm going to make up a scenario. You can correct me if any of it's a bad scenario, but let's say, there would be things that you could do to boost the production of crops in the short term that might damage the land for the longer term.
Yeah, exactly. You need to be thinking about every element of what you're doing, because profit, of course, is a part of being able to hand it down, but that longer term perspective of what's going to be happening on this land in 50 years when my grandchild's got it plays a part. And it is longer term thinking, Mark, exactly what you said, because when you're talking that purpose of, I want to hand this on to the next generation, it's not about yourself. It's about doing what you can do for that generation. Unfortunately, many of the farmers have so many other forces coming at them, largely from Mother Nature, that can really make their life tough at times. It's a wonderful life, and when things are high pressure and stressful, I still place myself back on the farm and imagine some of the things I used to do there. Yeah. But Mother Nature, and it's tough.
Yeah. So one other thing I wanted to ask you, Brad, that you mentioned earlier, the phrase, the word McDonalds-ization. There's certain things that come to mind to me, but also I'll just ask you, what were you taught about that phrase? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, the thing that really, when I first heard it, I was shocked, and I was like, oh my goodness, we're going to learn about McDonald's, but they phrased it with the caveat that that McDonald's have been highly successful at bringing together young teams of 15, 16-year-olds to be able to perform and achieve high performance and customer experience in all over the world in a standardized way, where you can walk into a store in Bangkok and have a similar experience to if you go into New York in a store. It's quite amazing. So again, just like Lean and Agile, the whole foundation of it comes back to high performance teams, and then using elements of Lean and Agile to actually achieve great results for customers. And then you see the evolution of McDonald's, where originally they had a Kanban. Like, you would go into the store and there was a Kanban of burgers, and then they've now got it to a place where it's more single piece flow. And you look at McDonald's and they, introduced self-service to get more flow in through the store and get rid of the queues. So the whole thinking of, just like Lean, just like Agile, McDonalds-ization, it starts with the high-performance teams, and then it goes rapidly to how do we make value flow for customers, the right value that customers actually want.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, there are probably, there are elements of system design and flow and standardization, and the perception of McDonald's is that, everything is in a procedure, binders of procedures, in a way it might be considered standard work. But the one thing that might be a little different is the culture around Kaizen. And I'm guessing based on perceptions. I've never worked at a McDonald's. I worked at a fast food restaurant when I was in high school, and I didn't do that very long. That wasn't a good fit for me. But I don't remember being engaged in improvement, and maybe that doesn't work because of the risk around, food safety or flavor. Maybe they have to be so concerned about standardization that maybe they're not engaging people the way, for a while Starbucks was teaching, Kaizen, Lean inspired continuous improvement to the baristas and the store managers, instead of just dictating from Seattle headquarters. And Chick-fil-A, which is a famous. Have you heard of Chick-fil-A, Brad? It's big here in the States.
No, not yet. No.
So they do chicken sandwiches, and I interviewed somebody from Chick-fil-A where they very specifically teach Lean methods to franchise owners who are interested in it. And so I'm curious your thoughts, or how do we build upon what might be some of the strengths of McDonalds-ization, but also make sure we're not being too rigid, in approaches to or possibilities for improvement.
Yeah, I think for me the key there is strategy and cultural deployment. I think that's the key. If you can do that very well, you can be having a culture of Kaizen that is moving forward, but still keeping some alignment to the brand and the direction of the company. That's the missing piece. Because you're right, Mark, it typically seems to go two ways, doesn't it? The one way you see is a company where it's highly structured, highly standardized, and it's one way, it's a highway. Or you see, but they may have still big project-based improvement they do, or kaikaku, as you'd say in Toyota production systems, Japanese. But then you get the other way, where you can get a company where it's maybe a franchise and there's a lot more freedom, but that freedom too can go too far if it's not aligned, and there's not that alignment. And I've seen that in some franchises as well. Yeah, it's finding that middle ground, isn't it? And I think, what's your thoughts on that, Mark? Because I would go, to me, mastering strategy and cultural deployment is such a key aspect of success in my mind anyway.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think whether I was, let's say, running a McDonald's location, or thinking of the work that I'm around in healthcare, I think you draw certain boundaries. There are certain things that must be formulaic.
Yeah.
And for McDonald's, that might be the food recipe. For Starbucks, that would be the drink recipe. In a hospital, let's say within a pharmacy, or with vaccination, you can't be innovative about how much you're diluting the vaccine. You have to follow really rigid science-based structure. But then there's room for a lot of continuous improvement and innovation around how does that syringe full of diluted vaccine flow to the patient? How does somebody arrange their workstation that they're using when they're giving the injection? So to me, I think you just sort of, you talk about what is completely non-negotiable. There are certain things that cannot be changed, or they have to be done through some strategic controlled initiative. But then there are a lot of things where you'd say, this is completely negotiable. Within these boundaries, you can figure out the best way to do the work.
Yeah. It's a good point, Mark, because I think I'll give another example. Those sort of standards, it creates quality at the source in a way. Like I work a lot in marketing teams, like with my book, it's brought me into the sales and marketing world heavily. If you go into a marketing team and they don't have a brand guide, you have masses of waiting, because invariably they're feeding up to the boss or the boss above to try get approval for every campaign they do or anything that's happening. As soon as you put in place that the field around the goalposts, and that framework, you've then got flow, and you get this ultimate performance happening because they know the boundaries to work within. I once had a HR leader say to me that, excellence in business is a lot like a football field. You've got the goalpost down the end of the field, the challenging goal, and then you've got this boundary line going around you. And there's like this, you've got this room you can move in, but there's some boundaries we need to work within. And I thought that was a really good analogy. It links to what you're saying too.
And I think what you said applies. You may have been thinking Australian rules football, where I was thinking American football.
That's why I left it out. Yeah, I was thinking to myself, okay, don't say Australian rules. Don't say.
I've seen a little bit of Australian rules football to at least appreciate. Yeah, there are goalposts.
Yeah, that's one thing in common. There's a standard there.
Right.
But Australian rules has 4 goalposts at each end, so that's a little bit of a variance.
Yeah. So Brad, coming back to Agile, and I want to hear a little bit about the story behind your book. And again, Brad's book is titled Agile Sales. How did you get started working with sales teams? And in particular, and this is going to be one of the themes for the episode here, people perhaps who were working remotely.
Yeah. So I ended up in a general management role for a long time in my career, and also I was involved in sales management. And if you talk lean and agile, and you talk lean traditionally applied in manufacturing, you talk agile typically applied in IT, it's both just about high performance teams. It's how do you get these high performance teams that you build that culture of continuous improvement and you move towards that goal. And whether it's a sales team, a factory, a hospital, it's about people. And so what I found early on, through some trial and error and challenges, I found that the same elements I learned out of Agile and IT and R&D and Lean out of the manufacturing and studying Toyota production systems, I found that they just applied to sales in the same way. The other aspect that did for me is sales has always traditionally been fairly remote. You had people all over the country, people all in different regions. And so applying it, you had to apply remotely. And so in the early days, we were using telephone, and we're using the old different screen share apps that you could get back in the day to be able to make a transparent board and, make data transparent. Of course, nowadays in sales, you've just got the most amazing systems through like CRM softwares like Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics or HubSpot. And so the key aspects of Agile, there's 3 key pillars. One is transparency. The second is inspection, that you're inspecting that transparency, that transparent data regularly. And the third pillar is adaptation, that based on that learning, frontline teams are adapting. Like you said, Mark, they've got the boundary lines, and they know where they've got a challenging goal, and they're able to adapt and improve and continuously evolve themselves. And so that's what made me think, okay, well, sales has been this area where everyone's seen it as an art form, and a lot of organizations just hire salespeople and say, rightio, here's your car, here's your keys, here's your phone, off you go sell us some stuff.
Sure.
And you only get a few high performers in that scenario where you take that approach, the same as if you did it in a factory, the same as if you did it in IT. And so that's why I wrote that book first, because I was like, okay, this is an area that really needs help, because it's an area that has not had any sort of systems and scientific thinking and even high performance cultural approaches applied to it, because traditionally it's all been about books that have been written that haven't been about systems and culture. They've been about how do you entice, manipulate, whatever you want to call it, a customer.
Yeah.
And so I felt it's the first book I should write.
Yeah. So when you say first book, least in your mind, there are other books that will probably follow.
Yeah, definitely. I enjoyed it. It was a tough road, but it was, as you know too, Mark, writing books. Does it get easier, Mark? Like you're up to your third now. Does it get easier?
In some ways, yeah. I mean, each book is its own unique creation in a way. So, I mean, yeah, you learn things about writing and managing that and publishing, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I've met some authors who say, nope, one and done. I wanted to write a book, and I'm glad that I did, but I'm never going to do it again. And then there are the authors who say, yeah, okay, now that I've done it, there'll be something else.
Yeah, I'll be there. I'll be back down the path.
Well, good. So I was wondering, we've got a lot of things we want to touch on here today, but, thinking back to, at the time of this recording, 11 months of, at least in the United States, for me, it's been 11 months. We'll call it roughly a year of life being upended, of course, with the pandemic and people adjusting to more remote work. What are some of the things that you've learned over this time about improvement work that's happening in more distributed workplaces?
Yeah, I think the same applies remote as it does in person. It's just applied differently and more important in a way. So the thing I find whenever I go into an organization or I work with a team, I always look for what's the motivator first. What's the purpose? What's the reason why they want to change and do something better? And without that, I find not much happens. And you've got so many studies and books that have been written on it. John Cotter talks a lot about the burning platform, and he talks about that negative emotion. Like, a purpose for change can be a negative emotion. I think the critical thing you got to be careful of is that it doesn't go too far, because otherwise if you fire it up too far, people will just run away, jump ship, or put their head in the sand. And then you've got, like, recently Simon Sinek writing about the just cause, more that positive emotion. Of course, he's famous for the start with why also. Right. So I think it can be a negative or positive, but you've got to find that purpose. And I think if it can be aligned to the top level of the organization, that's powerful, but it doesn't have to be, as you and I know. It can be you're creating a beachhead, a pilot within your own department or your own division, and you're going to look to really start to integrate excellence into your team. I've got one company, Mark, where they've done it really well. Like, their company's mission has always been helping Australian organisations compete. Like, these guys sell packaging. Signet is the company name, and Insignia is their sister company. And through COVID, they went remote, so they've used Microsoft Teams largely. Like, there's so many platforms you can use, and they've shifted everything to that platform. And we've actually found some benefits. Like, we found that people aren't having to travel to huddles or scrums, and people are able to rapidly jump on. But the other benefit is that from a purpose point of view, the CEO, he does a town hall for 15 minutes every Friday at lunchtime or just before lunch. And the whole organisation, whoever wants to, can join. It's not mandatory. And of course, in that town hall, he's referring back to the purpose constantly. And he's talking about what's happening and impacting the company right now and what it means to the people. And, that's powerful. You could not do that prior to the pandemic and a lot of the shift where people have really gone remote in a big way. So I think they've taken that element of transparency and also the element of purpose and really taken it to another level. So you can think quite smartly now about how do we run our rhythms from frontline teams to middle management to executive, but also to how do we maybe put in more of a town hall approach or more that open transparency where people can opt into hearing. And it's not always the CEO who talks. Sometimes it's different executives that will rotate and talk, but they're just sharing things that are happening and linking it back to the purpose and also communicating what it means to the people as much as they can. That helps everyone feel safer. People love certainty and they love being in the loop. So I think that plays a big part to start with, is getting to that whole motivational piece and thinking about how do we communicate that and really make it part of our DNA. And then also to allowing people to put it into their own language. So, of course, the sales team in that organisation I'm talking about, well, their language of helping Australia compete is very easy, because it's, okay, well, I'm going to find out what my customers are focused on, what their challenges and goals are, and I'm going to see how I can help them. I'm going to see how I can run improvement with them. And they use a PDCA cycle. It's in different words, but it follows a PDCA cycle to help them. The warehouse team, their driver is different. They've got a person down on the floor. He looks after the forklifts. So his driver is to do TPM and keep forklifts running, and he helps keep the site running. That allows them to dispatch, so they make sure that people have got their supplies they need. So their whole driver is, we help Australian industry keep moving, because we are slick at dispatch, and we really make sure we improve constantly to get better at how quickly can we get it out. And they're constantly pushing back how late they can dispatch, which means that more customers can order later in the day and get the goods the next day. So there's that's the example of that drive, getting the purpose down to what it means to people too.
Yeah. Well, so one thing I hear you saying, Brad, is that even though there may be some challenges in how do we connect with people and collaborate on improvement in a distributed workforce, that there are some technologies that maybe make it easier to communicate when it comes to trying to create alignment in an organization. And maybe one of the challenges is how to turn that from really effective one-way communication to two-way communication. Like, how would you incorporate cycles of catch ball in an organization through technologies? Have you seen people work on that piece of it?
Yeah, definitely. So in an agile approach, they do what's called big room planning. So in an agile approach, they actually get everyone in the one room. So with programs like Zoom now, and also Teams has got breakout rooms. So it's really cool that you can bring everyone into this big room to conduct catch ball, both for strategy but also culture and financials. And you can bring everyone together, and then you can break out. Then you can bring together, break out, bring together, break out. And there's that whole concept out of Agile, which is sort of focus on 5-person teams as much as possible, because it's known that that's sort of the highest performance base. But the technology of breakout rooms just makes it amazing. So that's one example that I see they're doing, that big room planning. The other approach is just really that traditional Hoshinkanri approach of form the top plan and then set up a series of, Teams or Zoom meetings with the people below, and then that cascades down to the people below, and you get that feedback, and then help people below form. But what I'm finding in this new remote world is you can do it so much more effectively and so much faster, because it's easy for people to be able to join meetings and run rapid, 15, 30-minute strategy and cultural deployment meetings. So either way works. And depending on the company culture, I choose either approach, and it seems to get the same result. Of course, big room planning can be a bit faster, but you can lose a bit more of that intimacy between leader and team, and then leader and team below. Yeah.
So you talk about purpose, and to give a little bit of a preview for some of the things that we're going to delve into, multiple P's, right? It's a good framework. And you talk about purpose and people and process and performance. What are some of your key lessons, Brad, related to people? You've already touched a little bit on some of this, but I think there's a lot I'm sure you could say on people.
And Mark, I think that's one thing I really find a difference between the typical Agile deployment and the typical Lean deployment. This is a variance, and please feel free to chime in here with this, Mark, because you've got such a big background. With people, Agile looks at putting the cross-functional team, if it's needed, at the front line. So one difference is you look at who's the customer. So let me apply it to a factory, because this is a different one. But you go to a factory and you go, who's the customer? The customer can be a machine. And so then you go, okay, so who's the team that we need working tightly together to keep that machine running? What capability do they need? And you choose your team based on that. The same in sales. In sales, you go, who's the customer? Okay, so the customer is a manufacturing customer and it's highly technical sale. Okay, well, who do we need working tightly together as a 4 or 5 person team to deliver great outcomes? Okay, well, it's not just a salesperson. We actually need the team to be a salesperson, a project or a technical person, a marketing person. And, we need these capabilities in that team. And so you form the team there, where a lot of the companies where I've, myself anyway, worked on a lean deployment, the cross-functional seems to happen at the divisional level, is where that true cross-functional happens. And so that's the team part. I've been doing a lot of that now, where in a company that really wants to amplify performance is just saying to them, okay, so who's the customer here? And who are the people that we need working together? Or what skills and capability do we need? One of the best examples in the world I see of this is special forces. When you look at a special forces team, there's a medic in there, in that 5-person team. There's a medic, there's a sniper, there's a demolitions expert. And then the role of those people is actually to cross-train the others, so that if, unfortunately, the medic gets injured or killed, they can still function. So it's really taking that philosophy and applying it to teams. But the autonomy and the empowerment you get in that scenario too is so great. And we all know how powerful that can be. So I find that taking members and forming them based on who the customer is for that process or that function. The one thing with teamwork in the remote world we're in now is there's a concept in Agile called quantum entanglement. And Agile have a lot of these patterns. So in Lean, we talk about behaviors. In Agile, they talk about patterns. These are patterns of behavior that determine success or failure. Quantum entanglement basically says that you need to entangle people where you need them to be able to work together and form that bond if you can. Now, in this world right now, we can't put people together easily for a number of months so they can really bond. But in traditional times, it was like, okay, let's put teams together for a while, let them really bond and form that connection, and then we can remotely move them apart and they can work remotely. And then quantum entanglement also says that you watch then key measures. So you watch cultural measures in your scrum or your huddle, and you watch performance measures. And over time, you'll see that they will plateau, because it's known that when people are remote, over time they can drift. The team bond, the team culture can drift. And so the concept is, once you see that happen, bring them back together and get them back together as a team for a period of time so they can reform, reconnect, and then split again. I'm finding now in this world we're in right now, you can still achieve it, but you just need to be a bit more creative about it. Like Friday afternoon drinks and remote board games, or whatever you can do to allow people to just connect as a team on a human side. Of course, there's going to be stuff that draws them together with work and draws them apart, challenges that come up. But I think you can still create outcomes by being quite creative on what are some unique ways using virtual technologies that we can bring people together to learn more about each other, live in each other's shoes more, show empathy to each other, find areas of relatedness and commonality that is actually, within a work context, but also outside of a work context. So I think that's what we need to do at the moment. We need to get creative as teams and think, how can we do that?
Yeah. I wanted to ask also, kind of thinking back to your time as a general manager. Many listeners here may be internal process improvement specialists or outside consultants. They don't have responsibility for the organization the way a general manager would. Were there lessons thinking back, even in traditional workplace environment, of lessons around engaging people? What does it really mean to create a learning organization?
Yeah. As a general manager, Mark, back in the day, I was very fortunate, because as a consultant or a business improvement lead in a business, you're cross-functional. Like your job is to be able to really understand and be able to help people and, guide people and influence, and that can be challenging. Whereas as a general manager, you are part of that direct cultural chain, and you can alter your behavior instantly to get better outcomes. Like it's amazing, because you basically, you alter yourself, you will get movement. And so I think the key for me when you are in that general management position is to be constantly running PDCA each day, each week, reflecting and reflecting on what you're seeing, but then also adjusting yourself, and then helping the team below you reflect and learn and adjust. And you can do this through one-on-ones. They're very important because that's where you can really focus in on the individual and help them. And also you can do it as part of teams, of course, as part of your scrum or your huddle or your toolbox or whatever you call it, your rapid performance meeting. And it's just, but again, as a GM, you're in the fortunate position that if you start demonstrating that behavior and then you start using language that demonstrates that behavior, you will instantly get movement.
Yeah.
As long as people see there's a bigger purpose to you and they actually feel some sort of bond or connection to you, you've got a great chance. Because as soon as you shift what you're talking about, Mark, where you go, okay, I want to create a learning organisation, I'm going to demonstrate constant learning and improvement and reflection, using PDCA well in the way that I conduct myself and improve myself, and then I'm going to help others. You're in a great spot.
Yeah. And I think having that past experience as a general manager probably helps you in working with organizations today. I mean, because I would say, frankly, I mean, that's a gap in my professional experience.
It's good because I also reflect, Mark, on the bad things that I did and the behaviors that negatively impacted the organization. And it gives me a level of humility in talking to others too, because even though I can be talking to a leader or observing a leader, and I could be thinking, oh my goodness, look at what's happening. But I've been there, I've done that. It's changing habit. Well, being aware and then changing habit is not easy.
Sure.
Not easy.
That's hard for individuals. That makes organizational behavior change and culture change even more challenging. It's that much more complex.
Yeah, especially if you've got the pressures coming at you, because as we know, when you're under stress, your conscious mind stops working effectively. Right. And so that's where it's so critical as a leader that you've, like you said, Mark, that you've got standard systems that help you break out of that. I can't think of any other way, especially if you are a leader and you have a lot of pressure coming at you, you actually need to block out the hour at the end of the week where you're going to reflect, and you need to hold to that like crazy. Like, to me, for a leader, I don't know if this might be hard for listeners, but Stephen Covey had that quadrant of important, not important, and then urgent, not urgent.
Right.
And, he spoke how the quadrant of to be highly effective is actually being in that not important, important, not urgent.
Right.
So being in important things that are not urgent, because these are the things you drop. But a lot of the things as a leader that you need to do to be able to really create that learning organisation, to keep improving yourself, to improve others, to really be effective, they're not urgent in the world of noise and everything we've got coming at us. So without structuring something to keep those things sacred and make sure you prioritise them, they can get lost so easily.
Yeah.
And I think we mainly call that leader-centered work, don't we? I think it applies to a CEO as much as it applies to a president, as much as it applies to middle management or frontline leadership, leader-centered work.
Yeah. And for the use of the word reflection as you did there, Brad, and people will, I tend not to throw around the Japanese word for this. People say, talking about hansei, just say reflection. I think there's maybe a recognition that, sure, reflection is important. But now, given an hour, if you were to say to me, okay, reflect, I might wonder, well, do I sit back in my chair? What's the structure, or is there standard work for reflection, as opposed to just saying, okay, create the space and now reflect and something magical will happen?
Yeah. I think you're right, Mark. It's important that you've also got that time blocked out that you're going to important areas of your organisation to see. Now, today in the virtual world, that's a little bit more difficult, but in some regards it isn't also. Like, if organisations are really living transparency, everyone's Zoom meetings and Teams meetings really need to be open. They need to be public. And you've also got so much technology now with virtual Google virtual reality and all sorts of things that you can easily get your hands on. But I think one of the best starting points is to have that, build in that transparency where every meeting's open. And so, a CEO can go to Gemba and go to a huddle that's happening in any team throughout the organisation, and just, you need that culture that people know this is our culture and this is what we do, and they're aware of anyone could turn up. And I think the senior leaders, as far up as you can go, need to demonstrate that too, where people can come into their meeting. And that creates that real easy ability to go to Gemba, listen, learn, observe, at least in a meeting, and then come back and reflect. And also, of course, going to the front line, you can then set up scenarios where certain people are willing to be able to, tour around with virtual reality or with just a FaceTime meeting or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of the quality and safety organisations now doing that well, doing their audits and their walks using virtual now also. It's a lot more efficient. Like when you think of a CEO who might be based in Seattle or might be based in Tokyo, it's a lot more efficient and easier. Now, it's not going to be as effective because you cannot beat being there on the floor, but the efficiency goes through the roof. They can do a lot more of them and cover a lot more turf more rapidly.
Yeah, there's efficiency, and then we can figure out how to also have effectiveness related to all that.
Yeah. And not come across like you're spying also, like you could go with cameras and things like that. It's just getting the cultural element right. And I guess what you do with the learning will demonstrate whether people see it as you're spying to beat people up, or whether you're actually doing it to learn and adjust your own behavior and help people to grow and develop. So I guess I've sort of answered my own question there, that maybe there is a space where there's cameras and you can go to Gemba and just stand and observe through the cameras. It's what you do, what your behavior is off the back of that's going to determine positive or negative outcome.
Yeah. It's definitely, it's the behaviors, because I can think of instances where a leader went out into the shop floor, or we might use the jargon of they went to the Gemba, hooray. Then they acted very badly. Yeah. Right. So not all factory floor or workplace visits are created equally. I think the behaviors matter greatly. Are we building trust? Are we being a helpful, supportive servant leader, or am I being a kind of punitive, focused cop, if you will?
Yeah. I've seen one organisation, Mark, where they've got cameras in the organisation, but they also have a TV screen next to it. So the video of, like you see myself, would show up on the TV screen while I'm there at Gemba, which is similar to being in the circle. The old traditional put the circle on the floor, stand in the circle. It's similar to that. So the team members on the floor or wherever they may be can see that a particular leader or someone is there, and that they're just doing their time at the front line. And so you can get both outcomes through that.
Yeah.
How low cost TV screens are nowadays too. It's not a big investment.
But I think there's an important point there about the respect that's shown by giving transparency in all directions. It's not just that as the leader, I have visibility into the work, but I think there's a challenging, provocative question around, well, how much transparency is there about the work of leaders?
Yeah.
To let people within the organization. I assume that's what you meant when you say public. You mean relatively public within the boundaries of the workforce.
Yeah. Right? I think that's what's important. And there's ways to be public and still, like, say you're on an acquisition and there's conversations about an acquisition happening. There's ways to give that acquisition a code name, and, because no one really should properly know who it is apart from certain people. But there's ways that you can still talk about some touchy topics that need to be kept confidential and still have it transparent. And that's been used so much throughout history.
Yeah.
Because that's the often line I will get from a senior leadership team. Oh, there's stuff we talk about that can't be public. It's like, well, there's ways that you can still do that and create transparency and keep that. Yeah.
I mean, that was an argument against open bullpen layouts for offices, or the idea that the CEO is also going to be in a cubicle. Well, yeah, if they really need to have a confidential conversation, there's a room they can go to, but that could be done by exception instead of letting that dictate all
Everything has to be locked down. Yeah, there's ways around it. It's sort of always just going that next why. Well, why? Is there other ways around this? Yep.
Yeah. Why or why not? Why not have more transparency?
Yeah. It certainly plays to that. What I've heard different studies that 70% of organizational behavior comes from what people see leaders do. I think it was actually an Australian lady that did that study, but I can't remember her name, sorry. But it's so true, because especially if a leader says one thing and then people see them do something else, that'll destroy culture quicker than anything will. Because there becomes that whole, they're a hypocrite, this is just rubbish. But if people see a leader demonstrate the behaviors that they want, sort of that old lead from the front, you'll more rapidly get that cultural change that you want.
Yeah. So we've talked about purpose and people. You've touched on process a little bit. I was wondering if you could share some more thoughts, again, kind of in particular in a COVID remote workplace environment. How can we learn about our process? How can we improve that process?
Mark, I think this is one of the best outcomes of being remote with process is the amount of platforms now that allow us to map in different technologies like Miro, Lucid Chart. There's thousands of them. I couldn't name them all. But it's so easy for a team to come together and do whatever mapping technique is most pertinent to really try and understand that process, and also the way to visually represent process for employees who need to refresh themselves. Like everyone's got at their fingertips a computer now. So I've been doing so many events on customer journey mapping to help teams really create greater flow throughout the whole organization for their customers. I've just been using templates out of Lucid Chart. I've been doing value stream mapping for factories and just using big picture mapping, even out of Visio, there's been that used. Just again on Teams or Zoom or whatever it might be. And then nowadays with having technology at your fingertips, the benefit of being able to do video work instructions, rapid video work instructions, or make your work instructions more visual. To update your work instructions is so quick because everyone's got them right there with them. There's just so many benefits. Like the most important thing I'm finding about Mark is that when people define that new process and they define that future state and they achieve that future state, I see a lot of teams where they don't put the right measures in place throughout it to show, is it actually sustaining, is it getting better? And that's a real gap. Like I think teams, we need to be able to look at that. The goal we're after, what's our process? What's the goal? Who's the process for? Okay, what are the lead measures we need in this process, or the quality, the control points for the critical control points to be able to measure? Okay, how do we make that transparent? And of course, that can then channel into transparent dashboards, which again are so much easier in a virtual world. So it's just upside when it comes to process in the virtual world.
Yeah. I mean, there seems to be kind of a pattern through this for every challenge is also some sort of opportunity where when we can't be in, let's say, I think, healthcare process improvement people who are told to work from home for their own health and safety, trying to work with people who, by the nature of their work in healthcare, have to be physically there, right? There's a lot of telemedicine that's happening, and that's been one of the opportunities, the acceleration of that's happened because of the pandemic. But you can't give an injection through telemedicine. And there's some other, you can't, there are different ways of helping people's breathing and obviously other treatment and testing that has to be done in person. So there are challenges for people trying to help support improvement work in those realms. But there's also been a lot of creativity and a lot of practice that I think will remain even when we get back to a semblance of normal or get back to the way it was before.
And Mark, I'm working with a large refinery in Australia, big, heavy manufacturing. And I'm even finding the remote world helping there, because you've got this massive site where people are spread kilometres away. And in a way, bringing in this virtual processes and virtual approach enables people to not have to travel kilometres for meetings and the efficiency gains, and people feel more connected. But the one thing you need to do, Bud, is keep considering that human bond bit, that quantum entanglement pattern out of Agile, is how do we do things to create that bond that's deeper than just work, and the purpose element to that too. So I think it's going to help industry right across the board if it's done the right way, because it always comes back to that behavioural bit that you and I have spoken a bit about today, is what behaviours do you do based on the new systems?
Yeah. And kind of the final P to talk about, I think, purpose, people, process are leading to the ends or the performance.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk about some of those connections and why, as much as we talk about process, I mean, we focus on purpose, people, process for a reason. How do you connect things to performance?
But with performance, for me, it comes back to the Mike Rother and Jeff Leica Toyota Carter model, where does every team have their challenging goal? And then off of that, have they defined their lead measures of criticality to be able to improve, to drive that challenging goal? But once they've got that, setting up the rhythm where they can collaborate and inspect, that data becomes transparent. The challenging goal becomes transparent. The lead measures become transparent. And also the work they're doing to improve becomes transparent. And then from there, how do we set up a way that they can inspect it regularly? And that's, the scrum, the one-on-one between a leader and the person. That's about the person and helping them. And then there's the scrum or the huddle or toolbox or whatever you call it, which is about the team. And then, as you mentioned earlier, Mark, how do you then scale that through the company? So how do you get that so that from the front line, right, anything that needs to be escalated can, because teams are going to come up with ideas to improve performance, and we want them to be coming up with the ideas they can do and the small ones and just enacting them and making them happen. But then what happens if a barrier comes up, or a challenge, or an improvement idea that is outside their capability to just enact? Where does that go? And how can it go there rapidly and get acted on rapidly, and then feedback come back to them rapidly? So in the Agile world, you're getting these really flat organizations, like, companies like Amazon and Tesla and these sort of companies are so flat because you've got that cross-functional set up at the front line, these cross-functional high-performance teams, and then it goes to, what's called a scrum of scrums, or a scrum above those, and then it'll eventually get up to an executive scrum. And then, of course, in the lean world, where it's a traditional waterfall structure or divisional structure, it's about those multi-tiered huddles and having those clear delineation of who can handle what at what level. Like, if you're going to have that hierarchy and not give complete empowerment at the front line need to be clear on what they can enact and then what they need to escalate. The middle management needs to be clear on what they can enact and what they need to escalate. I think a lot of this multi-tier approach breaks down where that clarity is not there. And what ends up happening, Mark, is everything ends up being pushed up because no one's willing to make a decision, because maybe there's a bit of fear in the culture, but also there's no clarity, again, no standard that says, look, this is your boundary line. You got that goal down the end of the field there. Here's your boundary line. Within these boundary lines here on the field, you can just do it and go. And so I think that's the key to performance, is having those key elements happen. And the final thing is the ability for leaders to coach. I really love the GROW model, Mark. I don't know what model of coaching you like, but I find the GROW model really simple, and I find if leaders can develop that capability to use that style of approach more and ask more open probe questions with humility, not leading, man, it makes a difference, because it instantly creates that empowered, but also that high performance focused culture where people are focused on the goal and why we're going for it. And Yeah, I think that's important too, is leaders' ability to coach and ask good questions. I think it's sort of an area of constant development. I know for me in my role as a consultant, or even as a podcast host like you, Mark, one of my constant reflections is on my coaching capability, my questioning. How do I go? What could I do better next time? What do I need to learn more of? It's one of those critical aspects I think plays a big part in success or failure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, there are a lot of good coaching models out there. The work of Edgar Schein is meaningful to me. The idea of humble coaching, humble consulting, humble inquiry. I also think of, earlier when we were talking about reflections, there's a firm I work with called Value Capture that teaches a reflection model. It's kind of, a series of questions of like, basically, we could reflect on the podcast this way, even like, what did you expect to happen? What actually happened? What was the gap? What do we learn from that gap or from that difference? What do we do differently next time? And, how will we know if that's led to something better? So I think, that thought process incorporates, you could call it PDCA or PDSA. There are elements to, other frameworks that are similar or familiar to that, I guess.
Mark, I think one thing I'd like to add to that performance bit and what you mentioned about reflection, and this might be good for the listeners who haven't come across the Agile techniques before. Agile has this technique in it where you time block what you're going to improve. So you time block within a month or a week or every day. We're going to execute this improvement effort in this time. And there's a whole heap of technique behind this, right? But it's time blocked. At Amazon, they're doing 2 a day. So they're releasing an iteration of improvement to what their business twice a day. Like, it's extremely rapid. But what in Agile, there's a key technique in Scrum, I should say. At the end of every iteration of time blocked, the team performs what's called a sprint review, which is where you're gaining feedback from stakeholders and customers, and you're learning from that. So you're using that sprint review to learn from stakeholders, customers and internal, based on the work you've done, and you're reflecting on that and using that for your next, you're putting more ideas and information into what's called your backlog of improvement on that.
Yeah.
But there's also another rapid sort of conversation that happens, which is called a retrospective. So this retrospective is where you're looking back on the sprint and the scrum that you've run and even the team culture, and you're going, how do we improve how we're improving? So it's like this retrospective on the improvement system and the team culture, and you're then using that to feed more improvement in to get better and faster at how we improve.
Right.
It's a really good technique, and that's links directly to what you're saying about that, reflection and review.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, again, our guest has been Brad Jeavons. The book is Agile Sales, Delivering Customer Journeys of Value and Delight. So you can find that on Amazon for sure and other booksellers. SA Partners, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the firm. I know Peter Hines is one of the co-founders. I've had a chance to talk to Peter before, and I've talked to some of your other colleagues from SA Partners. But if you can tell the audience a little bit about the firm and where they can learn more.
Yeah, Mark, Peter exuded this passion for sustaining improvement. How do we really help people and create cultures of sustaining improvement? And I think that's just disseminated into the company. Peter's now running the Enterprise Excellence Network and doing a lot of great work on training and other work that he does. And SA Partners still exudes that culture of how do we help organizations establish and sustain a culture of continuous improvement and excellence. They're linked to the Shingo Institute, and they do a lot of the work with the Shingo Institute. And that's what drives me, is that purpose to the organization. I really, really love working with them for that reason. They're not just a training organization. It's about how do we really help and tailor to that particular company. And they're all over the world. Like, you can look them up at sapartners.com. A lot of great content online. They just share freely. And there's just a really great purpose to the organization. Some great people. Mark, have you had Kevin Zokai on the show before?
He has done, I was just looking up, he has done a guest post on the blog about lean and green. He had me on to do, it was sort of a hybrid webinar podcast that he hosted. I should have Kevin on this podcast for sure. Peter, I went back and looked. I knew for sure I had interviewed Peter. He was the guest in episode 373. People want to go look for Peter Hines. Just scroll down in the podcast app, or you can go to leanblog.org/373.
Yeah, especially if you're struggling at all with how to really make it stick, the work of Peter Hines is amazing. Yeah,
so we talked about the concept of staying lean.
Yeah,
which if I remember is a title of it's the title of a book he wrote. Right?
Yeah, he wrote that, and recently he and Chris Butterworth have written a book called The Essence of Excellence, which is really, brings everything together. It's sort of my main base for everything now. I love it.
Yeah, good. So it does seem like a great group from I think the sample of people that I've talked to must be representative of the group as a whole.
Yeah, I think it's too part of our community, isn't it, Mark? Like the work you do and the work so many people do in our space just comes from a real place of purpose and helping people. Like we are very lucky to work in the arena we work in, whether it's lean or agile, or it all exudes the same. It's just this. We're in it for the bigger game of trying to help our future. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, I think of other bloggers and podcasters. There in the lean space, there's the spirit of collaboration and support and abundance. Or I don't look at you or Paul Critchley or Jamie Parker or others who have launched podcasts about lean. I don't think, they're going to steal listeners from me. I think, great, there's something else that I can listen to. And, I think there's room for people to listen to all of these different podcasts and yours included. And, we've had this, networking group, I've mentioned a little bit at the front of some episodes, Lean Communicators. And we have a website, leancommunicators.com, and Brad and I were talking about getting him involved in that effort. So it sticks out like a sore thumb if somebody is being territorial when it comes to lean and not being supportive and collaborative with others. So thank you for sharing that spirit of collaboration with us, Brad.
Yeah, it's kept me in the industry. I love it. If you can enjoy what you do for work, you're enjoying a lot of your life. So I've been very blessed.
Yeah. And one other example, going back recently to episode 400 with Jeff Leiker, you mentioned earlier Toyota Kata. And, I think the relationship and the collaboration between Jeff Leiker and Mike Rother sets a good example where, Mike was literally Jeff's student. Yeah. And then, Mike went wrote the Toyota Kata framework. And then, Jeff realized going from the first edition to the second edition of the Toyota Way, I think, he got a lot right in that first book, of course, but he learned a lot in the process, and he he very graciously gives credit to what now he has learned from Mike Rother. So, when the student can open the eyes a little bit more of the teacher, because look, that relationship, I don't know that relationship between them all that well, but clearly it hasn't splintered into like this sort of competitiveness of like, no, don't read his book. That's rubbish. My book is the only one that's good. Like there's a great learning and collaboration demonstrated there.
Yeah, Mark, that's a great example. That's a really good example. Yep.
Yeah. Well, Brad, thank you so much for being a guest on my podcast. I'm really glad that we could have a second conversation and build upon what we talked about the time not too long ago you hosted me on yours. So, and again, for the listeners, that podcast is the Enterprise Excellence Podcast.
Thanks so much, Mark. I really enjoyed the conversations, as I did when you're on my show. Yeah. And everyone, Mark's is, again, episode number 20, if you want to listen. Thanks so much, Mark.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for being here, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again. We just might not be recording it, but we'll talk again. We'll get you into the podcast group, and looking forward to learning from you.
Thanks, Mark.